Okay, so want to talk through a new feature, the player tendencies reports. Um, I'm just going to put myself in the Dickinson shoes and pretend we're scouting both Gettysburg for an upcoming game and our own team. So give you a sense of how to use the new data in both of those ways. So we're looking at Gettysburg. We were going to look at individual players. We might think about how we want to game plan for an individual guy. So we'll just pull up. Charlie's generally a very efficient player and pretty involved in the offense. And so when you get onto an individual player's page, what you'll see the new feature once this loads is the tendencies and splits section, right? So you're familiar with this. It's the Madden ratings that show the numbers for all the different categories for each guy. I've also had some tooltips to help you navigate that. So Charlie, very productive player, very efficient player. Definitely more of a passer than a scorer, finisher, but still a pretty effective shooter in general, right? He's a 41st percentile for shooting efficiency. Clearly, a guy that made his mark mostly as a passer. And so when we kind of dig into how we want to attack an individual player, the splits is really designed to kind of break down their contributions in various components of the shot clock, right? If you want a little more information, you can click that show explanation button. It'll show you all the underlying sort of how to use it and what it means. You can also see, peers is a big part of this. So if you click view peers, it'll show you the players that are in that peer group that he's being compared against. But what we're looking at here is 6 different charts. So the easy one, just up front, right? Shooting percentage. This basically shows the shooting percentage for Johnson, depending on where the shot came in the shot clock, right? So if there was more than 60 seconds left on the shot clock, he had 27 shots and shot 37%. That's the one bucket where he was a plus shooter relative to that peer group. In all the other buckets, 17%, 19%, 22%, he was a less effective shooter than the average, at least in terms of shooting percentage. And so if we're scouting right, we know that as a finisher, he is most dangerous in those early possession situations. He didn't have his highest percentage of shots there, right? So 38% of his shots came in the 20 to 40 seconds left bucket, which is quite a bit higher than that peer group. So he was generally took fewer of his shots early relative to that group and more late in the clock. And so, the takeaway there, right, is you've got a really effective shooter early. He didn't take a ton of shots, so you don't want to give him a chance to be more active as a finisher early on. The one piece here that I do think is interesting is sometimes we look at shooting percentages and say, oh, they're not great, not a good shooter. But, it's always important that we're looking at that on goal shooting percentage, right? So what percentage of his shots actually that were on cage went in, right? And so early in the clock, 93% of his shots that were on cage were goals, right? Very effective shooter. So even though and then late in the clock, even though his shooting percentages are lower than that peer group, his on-goal shooting percentages are actually right in line and even a bit higher, right? So you might look at him and say, not that effective of a shooter. He just didn't put a ton of shots on cage. When he did put shots on cage, he was very, very effective. And so the takeaway here is, right, again, he's not a guy that's going to, shoot a super high percentage, but you don't want to let him get going because when he does get shots from comfortable spots, he was able to can them. This goes to the idea of again that role and the decision making, right? So shots to assist ratio is that, right? We take the number of shots that he had in each of these sections divided by the number of assists, and then we can compare that against that peer group, right? So for a guy who made his mark as a facilitator, he actually is much more likely to shoot at the end of the clock, right? So he had 27 times as many shots as he did assists when there's less than 20 seconds left on the shot clock, compared to about half that ratio in the early buckets. So compared to that peer group, he was a lot more likely. He was more likely to shoot early, a lot less likely to shoot in that 40 to 60 seconds left bucket, and then towards the end of the clock, really likely. So if he's got the ball at the end of the clock, he's not looking to pass. He was in general, looking to shoot and try and kind of make something out of nothing as a finisher. Which is interesting, right? Because if you know that, and he's a guy that's looking to shoot, that might change how potentially you're sliding, right? I might be more likely to send another slide to him late in the clock because he's not showing that he's looking to pass. Whereas early in the clock, that's not the case. He's definitely looking to pass. So, here's a situation where you might want to say, hey, let's not slide, and hopefully force him into a shot that we can save or that ends up off cage. Similarly, right, your more common assist to turnover ratio kind of tells that similar story. It's a little bit of that opposite, right? So if you compare these two, it's sort of the inverse. His highest assist to turnover ratios were in that middle section of the clock. He was really effective as a passer and had really kind of strong ball security in that middle area of the shot clock, whereas less so late in the clock, and that kind of goes back to that idea that he kind of transitioned from being a passer to a shooter late in the clock. Um, and then the possession involvement, the story that we're looking at here is, are there guys that kind of shrink out of view, towards the end of the shot clock, or are they pretty consistent when they're making their mark? And basically the idea here is just to look at total shots, turnovers, and assists, and just kind of say, okay, of that total, when are they showing up? And so for him, he was most active in that 20 to 40 seconds left bucket. Less so everywhere else. Whereas, the peer group, right, there was a pretty clear trend, right? Most players who kind of filled that same niche in the offense or most active early and then kind of petered out toward the end. So he was a little bit unique in that situation. So I mean, that's the quick walkthrough of all these different reports. I mean, again, the idea is that should give you a better sense of sort of the decision making and the style that a player plays with, so that you can come up with a sort of a more granular and more sophisticated game plan, right? Because if you've got a guy who's a really prolific uh, finisher, but you see that late in the clock, he's actually as likely to create an assist as he is to shoot. That's going to tell you how, okay, when we get late, if he's got the ball, we might want to attack him a little bit differently. And so the point here is just to kind of say, where do these players, differ from that peer group, and how can we use that as a clue to construct a game plan? Similarly to everywhere else on the site, if you click the question mark, it will pull up an explanation of there it is. Pull up an explanation of what you're seeing there. And I've tried to put in an explanation of how I think about using that chart as part of this process, right? So, this is sort of the me in your ear saying, here's how I would think about these numbers. So that's from a scouting perspective. I think, this is equally useful if you're talking about your own player. So, we'll pull up Ethan from Dickinson. Pretty productive player, decent to sort of middling in terms of efficiency. Ball security was an issue, but as a facilitator, very, very strong. Lots of shots on cage, fewer shots in that actually went in. So you kind of get a picture of another player that's sort of a more successful as a facilitator than as a finisher. And so, we kind of take that similar approach here and try and say, okay, where does he differ the most from that peer group? And then how can I use that to build out a development plan for how I want him to think about decision making and where he's had success and where we think he can have more success. The interesting thing is for a shooter who is generally below average from a shooting percentage perspective, not the case early in the clock, right? So in the first, 30 seconds or 20 seconds of the shot clock, he was a very, very effective shooter. Much better than his peers. It was after that, once we got into the offense, where his shooting really, really, really struggled. So, interestingly, he took relatively few shots early in the clock and a much higher percentage late. If I'm looking at that, I say, okay, well, do we encourage him to be even more aggressive in early offense? Or is it just a question of, hey, if you're going to shoot late in the clock, we've got to figure out a better way to get you in good spots or know which shots to take, which shots not to. Because again, this is a guy who, if we go back up and look at his assist rate, I mean, he's in this 80th percentile, 79th percentile for sort of assists per touch. But, we see that as the clock extends from the beginning to the middle to the end, he's much more likely to shoot than to create those assists. So, again, you can look at that a couple different ways. One is, hey, why are we kind of taking our eyes off of potential passing lanes late in the clock? You're a great passer. Let's keep kind of pedal to the metal and see if we can find open teammates rather than just kind of default to, okay, the possession is getting long. Let's just start going to the goal. And you can kind of see that, he was in that middle section in that 40 to 60 seconds left. I mean, really strong assist to turnover ratio. Not a lot of mistakes, a lot of effective finding teammates. Really drops off in the last half of the shot clock. So, you can think of that as probably more of a matter of, okay, he's kind of not playing his strengths. He's a great passer, shooting is not where he's made his bread and butter. But we see a much higher proportion of his shots in the last half of the shot clock, and a much lower proportion of assists. So you start to think about that and say, what's happening there? What's the decision-making process that's sort of converting him from a facilitator to a passer? And then the question becomes, can we figure out a way to make him a better passer or a better shooter late in the clock? Or can we just kind of change that decision making? Hey, you're a great passer. Let's stick with what works, even as we're getting to the end of the shot clock. And you can see kind of the stakes are high for the offense, because this is the one bucket where he was not most active, but much more active than the peer group. So he's got the ball on his stick a lot late in the clock, and so if we can figure out a way to kind of flip the script here a little bit, that could have a big impact on the offense. And so again, my intent here is to give you, if I was sitting there thinking, how do we get a player to improve? That's how I'd start looking at these numbers. And it's going to be different again if you're talking about a player that you anticipate being a finisher, and plan on having a high percentage of shots late in the clock versus somebody that is more of a facilitator. But I think the intent is that it tells a much sort of more granular story than just looking at these percentiles, which can mask, as you see in this case, some really strong variability between success rates early and success rates late. So, the idea, again, if you're sitting down and trying to think, how can we get more out of an individual player? Digging into some of these splits and tendencies is probably a good first step, to know, okay, the Madden stuff gives you a sense of generally where are they strong, where are they weak. I think the intent here is that it gives you a much better sense of like, okay, how do I improve that? Knowing some of this stuff makes it more actionable and easier to build an actual development plan around this. So again, this is a pretty new feature. I'll be curious to hear how everybody uses it, what questions you have, what things you'd like to add. Keep an eye on this. My intent is that over time, as we start to figure out how people are using this, there will be some sort of more narrative style reports that says that, okay, here's what all these numbers are saying, put into 3 or 4 bullet points, so you have kind of the high level stuff right off the bat that you can use for an individual guy. So for now, it's mostly the charts, but again, look for this as we get more feedback on the feature, and there will be more here. So again, that's the tendencies and splits. It's available for every player on their detail page. If you have any questions about it or get stuck on anything, send me a note, and we can set up some time to go through it, or I can just answer your questions over email. All right.